All right. Welcome to another episode of the Meat Mafia podcast. We are joined here today with Dave Feldman and Salazzo as always. How's everyone doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on.
We're excited, Dave, to have you on. I think you and Clemenza ended up, was it DMing on Twitter? Clemenza, is that how you guys initially got connected?
Yeah, luckily I swung for the fences and was hoping to get Dave's attention, and he responded. So we're lucky to have him today.
Yeah, we're excited. Dave, we were doing a bit of research on you on the podcast, and we've heard some really technical discussions that you've gone into, and we had no idea that you're actually a software engineer and entrepreneur by trade and don't actually have a medical background and actually have had your own low carb journey in 2015. So I think to start, we would love to just learn a little bit more about your own dietary journey and really what got you into this whole cholesterol rabbit hole, which is so popular right now.
Yeah, as I like to say, what really got me into lipidology and everything that I'm doing today is initially fear, because I had gone on a ketogenic diet, and originally I did so in order to avoid getting type 2 diabetes, which was running fairly rampant on my dad's side of the family. I was keeping an eye on my A1C, which was looking great up until 2014, where I got an A1C of 6.1, which is right in the mid-range for pre-diabetes. And I was like, oh, you know what, though? It's probably because I was just eating a lot of junk food and stuff before then. For the next test, I'll have cleaned up my diet. I will have drank a lot less soda chronically, et cetera. But on my year later test, it came back again as 6.1. And I said to myself, okay, well, I don't want to get diabetes. So I started doing research. Granted, I knew nothing about diabetes or nutrition in general. And I found this interesting dichotomy at that time. This is 2015. Keto hadn't yet become big, but LCHF, low carb, high fat, was starting to come up, but not in the conventional medical space. But on these forums, there seemed to be a whole bunch of people who were helping to resolve their diabetes in these forums. And I found a lot of people who, a lot of what they were saying made sense. And I was like, I think this actually is something that makes a lot of mechanistic sense. I'm going to go ahead and try this myself. And very quickly, I was losing weight. I was feeling better. At the time, I was training with a marathon running, and that became easier. And both my dad and my sister, who also had some of their own issues that they were trying to work out. My dad was more advanced on the diabetes side. His A1C was close to like 8.3, I think. Got inspired to do this, about a month after I started. And so all three of us were doing this for about 6-7 months. They get their blood test before I do at around 6 months. And I told them, the only thing I ever hear about as being a possible problem is cholesterol. That for some people, it's very rare. For some people, cholesterol goes up. And because their tests were before mine, their cholesterol hadn't gone up that much. And that gave me comfort. I was like, oh, okay, mine's, they're first degree relatives. Mine's probably going to be fine. And then in November of 2015, that's when I got the 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper that would change my life forever, because I'm looking down at cholesterol, and unlike them, my cholesterol went sky high. It was crazy. So I think I average an LDL of around 130 before the ketogenic diet. And then I think it jumped up to something closer to, like, say, 240 or 250, something along those lines.
Wow.
And so in nearly doubling, I was shell shocked. I just didn't know what to think.
And physically, were you seeing the positive changes of the ketogenic diet, thinking that you were going to have that lower, more healthy looking blood test?
Yeah, I was looking forward to my blood test. I find a lot of people were like I was, and that they're like, oh, I can't wait to see because you feel great. I'm setting PRs, personal records, with my running. I'm feeling like I just returned to who I was in college, and just absolutely just feeling like I'm killing it. And So naturally, I assume all things in the blood just got better. And they did, except for this one thing. The cholesterol had gone through the roof, and that sort of activated if you know engineers, you know how we are.
Mhm.
And you can tell us, these broad stroke things. But if we want to understand something, we'll hit the books, we'll hit the internet, we'll need to understand enough for ourselves to feel that we have a grasp of what's going on. And so that was, getting back to my original statement, it was fear that drove me into trying to learn about lipidology. Lipids, ology being the study of lipids. That's the system that moves cholesterol around in our body. And as the story goes, and as I still contend to this day, I sort of feel like it was a right person, right time situation, in that I saw something very familiar to me. In software engineering, we work with networks. And that system that moves cholesterol around in our body, I contend, is absolutely characteristically, in many ways, a network. Absolutely.
Dave, what things did you come across in your research in 2015 that started to make you think that the narrative of what we're told about LDL cholesterol is probably incorrect?
Well, the very, very first thing I went to is what I thought was going to be just the easiest thing to find. I thought, okay, well, look. I don't actually even need to learn that much about lipidology. All I need to do is just look to existing population studies who have high LDL, especially in, later in life, and they should be dying off. And the people who should be with low LDL, especially lifelong low LDL, they should be the longest living. It's very comparable to smoking. You could do everything right. You could be getting all the right exercise, have the right diet, everything. But if you're smoking 3 packs a day, you're not making it into the 90s, into the hundreds, except for like the 1 or 2 edge cases, right? The one uncle your neighbor's friend's daughter has, or something like that. But that's not what I was finding. I was finding actually a number of studies that showed higher LDL associating with greater longevity. And I don't want to make it sound as if it was universal, because there was, we can get into this later, but there was, and still is, some kind of emerging counter narrative that actually, if you do certain amounts of modeling and so forth, then maybe there is a way in which higher lifetime LDL might be associated with more mortality. But I have some issues with those studies, since I've now learned a lot more about how these things are accomplished. But at a broad stroke base, if you just take the existing data and you just do something very raw, and you say, look, I just want to look at those people who had, say, a high LDL in their 80s, and I want to see how many of them are still alive in their late 90s, or for that matter, are centenarians who've made it into 100. You'll find a strong association with higher LDL. And so that already kind of got the thread pulled to, at that point in time, I was like, okay, I just don't think it's as simple as, not that high LDL couldn't be bad, but just that it's not as simple as high LDL is going to kill you, full stop. There seems to be a lot more to the story.
And Dave, so this lipid energy model, if you were to explain it in like its most simple terms, how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, so I have been kind of working on a little bit of a new stock speech, and I'm going to try it out on you guys, but you be the judge
first.
Love it.
All right. So we hear a lot about the term metabolism, and it is kind of important to understand this, because I think it's the basis of understanding chronic disease, especially in Western civilization. So it's the balance between anabolism, which is the building up of stuff, catabolism, which is the breaking down of stuff. But the stuff that we're usually talking about when talking about metabolism are energy stores, the fuel that we're fueled by. So if you are metabolically healthy / metabolically flexible, et cetera, to me, that's very suggestive that you're good about both putting away your fuel stores and getting them back out. Well, that's really relevant when we're talking about glucose, which is generally a carb-centric, and fatty acids, which are generally when you're fueled by fat. So if you're going to be fueled by carbohydrates and they're broken down to glucose, well, that's kind of relevant in how the body moves it around in the bloodstream, because you can put glucose in the bloodstream right now and it's soluble. It'll distribute into the bloodstream, just like if you take sugar and put it in water, it'll distribute evenly. But conversely, if you take like some butter, you take some oil, you throw that into water, you find that it doesn't distribute very well. And this is actually an interesting engineering problem on the part of the body, is it's saying, hey, how can I move these fats, these lipids through my bloodstream? And so the genius of the human body is it creates these carriers. They're like boats, and they are proteins. And so it packages these fats when you eat them into these large carrier proteins known as lipoproteins. And again, genius of the human body, these large boats, they contain all kinds of lipids. It's not just the fat you're fueled by, but it's also cholesterol, which, by the way, is needed by the body. It's needed by every single cell. Every single cell is made up of cholesterol and its exterior and its organelles, things like that. And also it's used for other things like sex hormones and other things we're not going to get into right now. But point is, anything that doesn't mix well with water, the body's pretty good about making use of these carrier proteins to move them through. So that becomes pretty important, because if we're powered by fat, getting back to metabolism, we need to continually and understandably store and pull back out these fuel sources, and in particular fat. Well, that means that we also have to bring that fat back to store it again. And that also gets used with these lipoproteins. So the most famous lipoprotein is VLDL, or rather its cousin LDL. Actually, I shouldn't say cousin. I'll just say its ultimate state. VLDL is triglyceride-rich lipoproteins that are being released by your liver, and they remodel to LDL after they've released their triglyceride payload, and other lipids, I should emphasize. But that said, that helps to explain why you find LDL cholesterol at higher levels in the bloodstream if you're powered a lot more by fat, and if you seem to be metabolically healthy. It's because the cholesterol on these lipoproteins, they're ride sharing with the triglycerides you are powered by. Now, often what happens at this point in my pitch or the story and so forth is people immediately go, no, wait a sec, triglycerides. I have a low level of triglycerides in the blood. In fact, when I went on a ketogenic diet, my triglycerides went down. Mm-hmm. And this, by the way, is one of the hardest parts of this lipid energy model to get across to people, because a lot of people naturally think that if you're powered more by, say, triglycerides, then you should see more of them in the blood. But that's not how it works with glucose, right? Mm-hmm. You probably know people who are powered by glucose. They're on a carbohydrate-centric diet. Well, the reason their glucose isn't high, if they're very healthy, is because they're very good at storing that glucose in the form of glycogen and pulling it back out again. But their utilization is much higher, so the turnover is much higher. And that's exactly what we believe is going on with this lipid energy model. We believe that triglyceride turnover is very high. In fact, the higher LDL cholesterol that I saw back then and that I see now, and that we see with many people who seem to be metabolically flexible, is actually downstream of a whole lot of that turnover of delivery of those triglycerides, and these sort of, you can almost call them empty boats, because they're just getting used at a higher frequency. So how'd I do? Did you guys agree with that?
Yeah. And I mean, it seems like it makes sense. I don't have the technical prowess, but it seems like with a normal distribution curve, you would have one particular subset that's more efficient and might have that higher LDL like they're just more efficient at moving triglycerides and cholesterol and fat throughout the body, so that LDL might just be an indication that they're really efficient at moving cholesterol around the body. Is that fair to say?
High LDL alongside low triglycerides. That's kind of a key factor. Now, to emphasize, there are other things that modify LDL levels that influence it, such as genetics, such as medication. There are other things that can change these levels. So I don't want to make it sound as though the energy model explains everything there is, but we do believe it's in a metabolically healthy context, probably the most predominant influence of all. Now, I'll tie this up with one analogy while that's fresh in your mind that a lot of people can connect to and that I really like, which is, let's pretend all three of us are up looking down on a harbor where there's boats coming in and out that are delivering cargo, right? And in this story, I'm going to be the antagonist. The three of us are up there and I go, oh man, there's like 100 boats down there in the harbor. There shouldn't be 100 boats. That seems like too many. They should be able to do this on less boats. They should be able to do it on like 20 boats. And you guys go, now, hold on, Dave, hold on. Let's just watch. And we're watching, and we're seeing the boats leaving with cargo. And we're seeing boats coming back empty to the harbor. You go, I think, Dave, there just needs to be 100 boats to maintain that level of trafficking of the cargo. Like, all right, maybe you're right. We come back a year later and now there's 1,000 boats going on. I'm like, okay, guys, come on. That's like way too many boats. And you guys are like, yeah, hold on. Let's just see. It seems like there's just that much more cargo that's going out and there's just that many more boats coming back. Frankly, Dave, it seems like all of those empty boats coming back are just indicative of a successful delivery system. That the number of boats are just an indication of what it's going to take to meet that demand of the amount of cargo. It seems like there's just 10 times the cargo that needs to be delivered compared to last year, right? Now, keep that in your head. Let's change it. Let's say instead, you're looking at 30 boats, but they're all full of cargo and they're not going anywhere. They're just kind of like bouncing around in the harbor. And I'm like, oh, good. There's only 30 boats. I feel a lot better about that. How do you guys feel about that?
Seems like there's a bit of an inefficiency there, right? I mean,
there is. So what do we see in folks that have metabolic syndrome? They tend to not just have a higher waist to hip ratio, and they tend to not only have higher, say, blood pressure, but they often have high triglycerides and low HDL, which we'll get to in 1 second.
Yeah.
But the high triglycerides, that's the cargo. The cargo, the fat in the blood, is failing to get delivered to the tissues. Just like when you're looking at high levels of glucose. Bringing this all back to metabolism, guess what I feel like I'm seeing? I'm seeing a failure to store. You're not doing a good job at putting your energy away and pulling it back out, right? So a lot of it's just parked in the bloodstream. And that's why that utilization is such a crucial thing. So it's important from an engineering standpoint that we're all thinking about this systemically. I know you guys are going to have a zillion people on that get inside the cell and the mitochondria. And believe me, all of that's crucial. It's super important. But there also needs to be a lot more top view, right? A lot more traffic at a systemic level and how the network is or is not succeeding.
And we think the people listening to this are going to love having that top view that you just provided, Dave. This is probably a really loaded question, and I'm sure you've spent countless hours thinking about it, but why within Western society do we demonize high LDL, yet we overlook things like HDL to triglyceride ratio? Because we talk about this all the time. Just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I mean, this is a little bit Occam's razor, but the growth of LDL cholesterol as a marker of concern was it's a process of discovery. So going back 100 years ago, when we were first looking at plaques, there was cholesterol, there were sterols there. And because there was cholesterol there, it ultimately would lead to first thinking, hey, we shouldn't eat this. If we consume cholesterol, it's going to end up there. I mean, if we just don't consume it, it's not going to end up there, right? Mm-hmm. This ultimately then led further to Ansel Keys and the diet heart hypothesis. Well, actually, not just consumption of cholesterol, but also saturated fat seems to have an association with higher levels of cholesterol in the blood, which, by the way, accurate. I would say that tends to be the case. If you have higher saturated fat, it's a little bit loose. And again, there are lots of other influences, but I would agree that generally speaking, you're going to see higher levels of cholesterol, mm-hmm. right? Well, then that LDL, as I said, there's these different subtypes of lipoproteins. That became a discovery much later. And then the cholesterol found on it much later. And around that time, we were starting to discover this HDL, high density lipoproteins. And it seemed to be that cholesterol found on high density lipoproteins was generally a good marker, that the higher it was, the lower your cardiovascular disease. So this gives me a good segue, because I want to bring this back to the energy model for just a second to help explain why the high LDL or the high HDL, we believe, is going to be associated with better cardiovascular outcomes. You remember how I talked about the turnover? We're actually seeing the cargo getting delivered to the tissues that either want it. There's oxidative tissues like skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle. They're going to use it pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. And then there's the fat cells, which are adipocytes. That's our stores, right? So you're either storing them in adipocytes and to some degree into other cells and intramuscular fat, that kind of thing. But generally speaking, in adipocytes, or you're using them with oxidative tissues. Either of those cases, you're turning them over. And the more you're turning them over, the more the triglycerides are taken out of these lipoproteins. But what's interesting about lipoproteins is they're kind of like a water balloon, if you will. As you're taking the water out of the water balloon, it gets smaller. But if you guys, start learning you guys probably already know this, but many people don't know this about biochemistry. Molecules don't actually shrink, right? It's not like they just squish together. So what has to happen in order for these lipoproteins to get smaller is they shed their surface area, their phospholipids and free cholesterol. What happens to those pieces that are like getting released? Well, that's where it gets kind of interesting, because that's where HDL comes in. HDL are these boats that are sort of on standby. They're doing lots of different things, but one of the key things they're doing that gets very little recognition is that they're picking up the surface components of the VLDL as it's remodeling to LDL. Mm-hmm. And so you can think of VLDL as something that starts big and is supposed to get small. It's supposed to deliver things. But we have this likewise fleet of lipoproteins on the other side that start small and are supposed to get big. How do they get big? The same way that the VLDL gets small, they pick up the pieces. And as they do, they're also going to be picking up cholesterol cargo. And I don't want to get too technical, but that's the origin of a lot of the higher cholesterol, in our opinion, per the Lipid Energy Model, that you're seeing in those folks like me, who when they went low carb, saw their triglycerides drop and their LDL go way up. Seemingly their HDL tends to go up in tandem, right? By now, I'll bet you guys have already seen this yourself. You may have even experienced it yourself. You may have seen your HDL cholesterol go up, the so-called good cholesterol. And we believe that basically, in short, this is a result of the higher turnover, the higher resulting delivery of that cargo, and why it's a good proxy, why it's saying, hey, this is what we think is going on, because this is usually the result of how that happens. So getting back to even before the keto diet began and this discovery of HDL cholesterol, that's why we think that association is there, is because even in folks who are on mixed diets, if they're seeing higher levels of HDL cholesterol, that suggests a higher likelihood of good metabolic health.
And on the metabolic health point, it's interesting because in the 70s, or even before that, there's an introduction of much more processed foods, which I think you could probably reduce down as one of the major contributing factors to a lot of the metabolic dysfunction. So the systems and network effect that you're looking at and saying, okay, why is the network, or is the network working properly? You can kind of see, okay, the network had this thing that's introduced that's disrupting and changing the network. So we need to go back and look before, most people were having some sort of a metabolic issue to really try to understand the story. So maybe it's a good segue to go into some of your work on the lean mass hyper responders. We haven't said the actual expression yet, but you're doing a bunch of work on it, and I'm curious where you guys are at. And I know you recently said that you're looking for people to contribute into the study, but maybe just start from the beginning of like what like where you guys are at now and where you guys are heading with it.
Yeah, sure. So the origin of that word, I realized the phrase is a bit of a mouthful. I had first coined it, not knowing I was coining something that would become so relevant in my life later. In 2017, when I was first writing about this pattern. So we've already discussed the pattern in many ways up to this point, this triad of high LDL, high HDL, low triglycerides, and just straight up pattern recognition. I kept seeing this over and over again in 2017. Again, my research effectively started in that November of 2015. And I kept thinking it was going to be over in the next 5 minutes. Like I would eventually get it to the right people who would care and be more interested and have more resources than I did. So I kept trying to kind of like move it along, but figuring there would just be a point where, I got it to a good PhD team, something, they would start doing it. So this pattern that I kept seeing, not just with the triad of those three together, but of a very pronounced triad, where it seemed to be the people who were the leanest and seemingly the most metabolically healthy would have the highest LDL, highest HDL, and lowest triglycerides. Now, it's worth taking a moment to impress on people in general. These cut points for lean mass hyperresponder, they're LDL of 200 milligrams per deciliter or higher, HDL of 80 milligrams per deciliter or higher, and triglycerides of 70 milligrams per deciliter or lower. Those three cut points, while I did kind of just sort of pull them out based on what I was observing over time, all three of those are extremely rare on their own. It's already hard to find in just a large population any of those three by themselves. And in fact, in the NHANES population, which is from the CDC, we looked and I think there were 3 out of 90,000. So that gives you an idea of just how rare it was before this point in time, before the rise of the ketogenic diet. And that excites the engineer in me because to me, it says that this phenotype, which we now have a Facebook group that has thousands in them of this phenotype. I think that this is a major frontier of potential discovery, because from an engineering standpoint, I've got to ask, hey, wait a sec, how do you have this alignment across all these 3 axes if there's not a mechanistic commonality? I mean, this is across all ages and genders and ethnicities. I mean, come on, there's really something incredible here, because we do not normally see this level of alignment across these metabolic markers, except in the opposite direction with metabolic syndrome, where you see the opposite, where you see things like atherogenic dyslipidemia, which is characterized by low HDL, high triglycerides. You can almost say these folks are reverse metabolic syndrome, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So this happens in 2017. And in that year, it really dawned on me that we really just need to study this phenotype in particular, because if the lipid hypothesis proves true, that high LDL cholesterol is causally going to cause greater atherosclerosis, regardless of the context, this is the perfect experiment group, because virtually any time we're seeing that association of high LDL alongside high development of plaque in the arteries, known as atherosclerosis, it is usually in the context of other cardiovascular disease risk factors, such as atherogenic dyslipidemia, such as, for example, having high triglycerides and low HDL. And that alone was like, okay, well, yeah, I mean, if you wanted any experiment to specifically test, you want to get all cardiovascular risk factors low, save the one of interest, the high LDL, right? And so I started at first seeing if I could, again, get the lipidologists interested in this. I went to conferences, I was knocking on doors, and it never happened. I was never able to get, I could not get anybody interested enough. And so I had this crazy idea. It's just insane. Looking back on it now, it may look like it wasn't insane, but I'm telling you, it was nuts. I set up a charity in the months before I was going to appear at Low Carb Houston. I got up on the stage and I said, I need at least $50,000 to do a study, but really I want $200,000. It's just said this aloud to an audience and on the internet and said, guys, let's just crowdfund this study. Let's get the money from the community. And if you guys can help me get to this goal, and then we'll study them. I figure it'll be around $2,000 per lean mass hyperresponder that we study. And, let's just make this happen ourselves. And that's what happened. We're now into the study. So yes, sorry, I know that was kind of a long story, but it's an important one to kind of know from the front to the back. But yes, thank you for the opportunity for the plug. If this, up until this point in this time of the episode, this sounds like you, if you have a high LDL cholesterol, if you have a high HDL cholesterol and low triglycerides, it's slightly different than the cut points I mentioned before. It's an LDL of 190 or higher, if you have an HDL of 60 or higher, and if you have triglycerides of 80 or lower, and your LDL started at lower before this point, go to lmhrstudy.com, and that'll take you to our official page. And from there, you can read your qualifications and then contact the Lundquist Institute, which is where we're doing the study out of.
Has it been challenging to find this certain phenotype? It seems like probably not a lot of people are that. If you're healthy, you're probably not checking. Like if you felt very healthy, like this phenotype is, like, are you checking your blood work enough to then go, okay, like I'm going to contribute to this study, this new study that's happening? It must be hard finding them, right?
It's been a little bit of a challenge, not a lot of a challenge. We think we are going to meet the recruitment goal for sure.
Awesome.
It's just the irony is a lot of the folks who are already comfortable being lean mass hyperresponders are not checking into social media in the first place. A lot, I mean, for sure, we certainly have many that are in the groups, but that said, it's if you're already somebody who was not likely to be adherent to standard medical guidelines, which incidentally is not something I'm specifically advocating or anything like that. But if that archetype of person is a little harder to reach, because what's Facebook groups that usually center around something that is of concern, it's usually because it's like haunting them. And that's why they keep coming on to it. It's like a support group or something like that.
Right.
And our Facebook groups around this, they are actually very sciencey centric, which is kind of cool because they're very interested in the science on this. And there's a lot of debate, a lot of people who think I'm wrong, the Lipid Energy Model and so on and so forth. But I love all of that and I encourage all of that. Mm-hmm. But if you found out you were a lean mass hyperresponder, you're finding out everything you can about it, and then you come to the conclusion, oh, actually, I feel like I'm probably fine with this, or I'm going to check in on it later. You're probably not constantly following this work because you reached that conclusion and you've moved on. That's more the archetype of the person who I might have been, that archetype. If I didn't myself get caught up in this, if I thought somebody else was doing a lot of the work on it, and I felt like, sure, I'm going to monitor it closer, but otherwise I feel like I'm, going to carry on. I have a busy life to begin with. I probably wouldn't keep checking in. So that's the one challenge with the recruitment, is just to reach enough people.
Mm-hmm. Dave, can you put a percentage on the number of people that you think would fall into the category of a lean mass hyperresponder?
Oh, that's hard because I kind of described the whole low carb movement as two waves. The first wave is sort of the Atkins wave. Mm-hmm. And it's mainly those folks were mainly predominantly those who were already metabolically challenged and were just willing to try anything, because of course saturated fat was and actually really still is considered so pathogenic that doctors would be more likely to let the patient do whatever if they were getting some kind of results. And really, I mean, truly, only until, I want to say maybe the last 7 years, practically matches the amount of time that I've been doing this research, has there been enough of an interest, especially with ketogenic dieting, that folks who weren't already metabolically challenged were in large quantities coming into and adopting this diet. And I should say overtly metabolically challenged, because I'm sure you guys will agree, there actually are lots of people who don't even realize that they're pre-diabetic or that they're just on their way to type 2 diabetes, who are like me. They're like, wait, I want to hold up the train now, because I'm pretty confident I would have ended up there, right? Point is, a lot of folks who are me, who are kind of in the part way, or for that matter, people who are just like, you know what, I just want to see what this will do for my athletic performance, even though I have no medically indicated reason to do this. Those are the folks that are going to become lean mass hyperresponders. Well, so I can say that percentage is growing, whatever the proportion is relative to everybody else, but I couldn't tell you for sure what it is. If I had to go out on a limb and guess, I would guess it's somewhere close to 3 or 5% of the total number of people who go on a ketogenic diet right now. But that's, again, just pulling a number out of the air.
Got it. And what's interesting too, is you were mentioning how when you did your ketogenic diet in 2015, you got your blood work done. I think you said the LDL level was 240 or 250. Yet in the meantime, I know you've done a bunch of experiments where you've raised your LDL to crazy high numbers, like I think almost as high as 400. Then you've also gotten it as low as, I think, 98 milligrams per deciliter. Could you talk a little bit on those experiments? Because that's fascinating to us.
Yes, in fact, I did. The experiment you may be referring to is probably the one I'm most famous for at this point. And it was sort of it's kind of a cathartic moment, because I sort of said, you know, I feel as though a lot of people, particularly if they're considering a plant-based diet, and I'm not disparaging a plant-based diet, but a lot of times, a lot of things are cited for what it is about the plant-based diet that lowers cholesterol. And I wanted to say, look, I'm going to just demonstrate that actually you can have a high meat diet and lower your cholesterol substantially in a very short amount of time through use of the Lipid Energy Model. That I'm going to show it's from changing to a predominantly fat-centric diet to a predominantly carb-centric diet. And so I intentionally chose a poor quality diet that nobody would specifically recommend. And so it was white bread and lean processed meat. Maybe the lean processed meat is a closer call, but certainly Wonder Bread and bologna sandwiches. Nobody's going, you should just eat this all day long, all the time, because that's going to be healthy, right? But there's no phytosterols. There's no, I had a multivitamin alongside it, but that was also part of the control. So here was the experiment. The experiment was I was going to start at a ketogenic level, and even if anything, a more adherent ketogenic diet to see where my cholesterol landed. And it landed at the beginning of the experiment, I want to say somewhere in the neighborhood of 296. Again, an LDL of 296, for if your listeners are not familiar, that's 3 times the recommended amount. Like, it's recommended you have an LDL of 100 or less. So 296 would already likely in most doctors' office get me a diagnosis of having the genetic disease of having high cholesterol, which we get all the time from people who have it. So that was day 0 that I was at that level. And then I consumed this diet that was entirely of white bread and processed meat, took pictures of everything, was wearing a CGM throughout the whole period, and was constantly taking my lipids throughout the whole period. And sure enough, as I moved from a fat adapted state that was predominantly powered by fat to a carb centric state that was predominantly powered by glucose, my LDL cholesterol dropped by 40 milligrams per deciliter a day going from that 296 down to 83.
Wow.
And the truth is, I probably could have lowered it further still, but I was wearing the CGM through the whole period of time, and I really did not like what my CGM was telling me. It was just, it was, of course, my glucose was just like the Alps throughout that whole time. It was super high. Thus, just to take a little geek aside for those people who are into the biochemistry, thus I was likely hyperinsulinemic. I was likely predominantly in a storage mode where both my insulin and my leptin were high. Therefore, I was predominantly putting glycogen away. All of these would result in less circulating VLDL and therefore less circulating LDL, which I knew was the likely outcome. That's why I did this experiment. Because if you just look at like 1% of 1% of the experiments that I've done, and I realize we haven't taken the time to go over it, but in that, 2015 to 2017, 2018, I've done a lot of personal experiments to help demonstrate the energy model. If you just look at just like 1% of those, I would hope you would come away going, I can't believe we make these huge decisions based on a single blood test of lipids, because I'm at least demonstrating how much these things change in just a matter of days, which you have to take into account, because that's the amazing thing about the human body, is it's just constantly pulling these different levers to change exactly how those look, based on how you're utilizing your metabolism. And it's awesome. It's something really amazing.
What are some of those other experiments that you would put alongside the one that you just mentioned that might be interesting for the audience to hear about?
Well, I have also somewhat famously intentionally gained 20 pounds.
Really?
Captured my metrics going up. One of my favorite findings from that was I took a DEXA near the beginning, and then another DEXA 3 days later after having consumed a lot more carbohydrates. And we saw from the DEXA that I gained 4.1 pounds of lean mass in my legs in 3 days. Wow. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're like, Dave, you must have been doing leg presses like crazy, right? No, I was not. In fact, I kept my exercise controlled. It was always around 2.5 miles of walking a day. So unless you feel like the carbohydrates just magically added muscle, no, you should correctly assess that actually that was added glycogen and water. That's likely what's appearing. That's kind of important because sure enough, on the flip side, on my way down, after I adopted a ketogenic diet, I did further DEXAs, and I lost about the same amount of weight, about 4 pounds of quote unquote lean mass from the DEXA. So do I conclude I must have lost muscle mass going from the weight gain diet to the ketogenic diet? No, again, probably the loss of glycogen and water. But that's certainly very relevant for, I'm sure, many people who listen to you and many of these podcasts who hear that ketogenic diet is going to result in catabolizing of your muscle. I personally have not been able to see anything that's very compelling, very convincing to me of that, save, some situation of anorexia or something along those lines, right? Mm-hmm. Another one I'll just mention real quick is I call it the resistance training experiment. So a hypothesis I had for a long time before I had executed this, and I want to say this is 2018 or 2019, was that I believe that if you're doing resistance training especially, you're going to induce a greater amount of your muscle tissue taking up lipoproteins for growth and repair. Mm-hmm. This process is known as endocytosis. And it makes sense because basically cells, again, their membranes are made with cholesterol. So if you need new membranes, you need new cholesterol on top of other things. And therefore, by demand, it's going to pull in more of them via endocytosis. I don't know how much that would account for the total balance that would change. I felt pretty confident that we would be able to at least see that if I induced it in a very controlled manner. So sure enough, because I'm me, I ate exactly the same diet, exactly the same way for 20 days straight, save 2 interventions. One that was, I want to say 8 or 9 days in, and then another one that was another 5 or 6 days in, something like that. And so you can, and I was taking my lipids every single day. So you can actually see over time what those interventions did. And it almost looks like it faked the data. The data is so good looking. You can see the line where the intervention takes place, and you can see it dip. And it's like it goes down and it kind of comes back up again, right up into about my next intervention, where it does another dip. The first time if memory serves, the first time it was a drop of around 11%. And the second time it was a drop of around 13%. When I did a resistance training intervention. So those were the only changes in this entire experiment was when I took a couple hours to do a lot of exercise for both of those interventions. Bearing in mind that I'm an amateur like lifter, et cetera. So I also didn't even overdo it because I didn't want to risk injury. But it worked as far as I could tell. So I was pretty happy about that.
Dave, to that point, I know you mentioned that you said you've done multiple marathons. Have you gotten to dig into the world of fat adapted endurance? And the reason why we asked that is we just had a gentleman on who did a fully fat adapted Ironman, where I think he ate 3 hard-boiled eggs and did the Ironman in like 10 hours, which is pretty incredible. So just curious. Yeah, he'd probably be a great person for you to talk to. He's sorry, Clemenza, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, we've got to make that connection because for no other reason other than the story is just amazing. But yeah.
Yeah, he's pretty much completely carnivore, and he, got himself into that state of fat adaptation where he was able to do the Ironman. And I think he ended up learning it from Pete Jacobs, who won Kona in 2012, and he's now carnivore and does a lot of fat adapted racing. So was just curious if you've been able to go down the fat adapted endurance rabbit hole, and if you've seen an uptick in your performance at all and ability to race.
Well, first of all, I'm qualifiably not athletic on a personal level now. I have so many responsibilities that unfortunately I've allowed for exercise to kind of fall off. I'm not proud of that. I really do want to get to a point where I can return to that to an extent, but certainly I have maintained a lot of contact with a lot of folks who are at these kind of elite levels. I'm sure you guys know all about Zach Bitter, for example. Although he does something that does include carbohydrates in a kind of cyclical manner. But I do know and have worked with, I'm sure you guys know this about ultra athletes. They tend to be gun shy about sharing too much of their protocol because they kind of feel like that's their edge. But I will tell you, for example, there's an ultra marathoner I know who would prefer to remain private, but who has I've watched in real time as he's gotten more and better at his performance drive. And I will go ahead and share with you and your listeners this. Getting back to the systemic, I do believe, and this is something that I've worked with this ultramarathoner on, I do believe that there is a kind of fine tuning at a systemic level based on the propagation of energy substrates that you're moving through. So let me, it's hard to explain this without getting a little geeky. So let me get just a little geeky for a moment, and then I'll come back to the top. When you're handling things systemically, there are, of course, a lot of development of things like hormones. Those hormones are intentionally meant to be used outside of cells to signal and work with other cells. So if you think about this at a very microscopic level, you're kind of conducting an orchestra with your endocrine system, right? Okay. In that sense, how much can what the cells expect matter for a greater performance edge? I think it actually could be quite a bit. I think actually this is where there's a kind of complement of enzymatic activity that if you get really strong at equalizing the nature of what your diet is, and then fine tuning how that diet could be just a little bit better and better, but then being very careful about it, being very consistent coming up to the point at which you're doing something performant, especially if it's endurance based, it's going to be very relevant to your potential outcome. Because what you've just done is you've trained your cells against what the concept of it is. So forget about even just muscle memory. Let's talk about biochemical memory, right? You're effectively saying, okay, this is about what we're going to be at in order to accomplish this over and over again. And this is why I think training is good, not just for getting yourself into a mental state of being able to accomplish what it is and having a sense of what it feels like to do whatever it is that you're doing. But on top of that, you're wanting to fine tune what the supply and demand is deep down at that cellular level to bring it back up to the systemic. Hopefully I articulated that well, but that's kind of the basis of what, if I were working with athletes more that I'd be training, is I'd be like the boring guy. Because I would say the more boring and predictable your diet is, but that is still very much tuned to exactly what your performance intents are, the more relevant it is, to where I wouldn't even want you changing gears, within the week of where you're doing this. I wouldn't want you, celebrating with particular food outcomes or anything along those lines. I would say train all your cells as well as your muscles for what's to come. That would be my one piece that I would add to that.
I think that almost perfectly overlays how he went about doing it. I think it was just like get your body adapted to that certain zone and train your body so well in that way that it doesn't know anything otherwise. Dave, I'm curious, what's kind of like the playbook of criticism against like the work that you're doing, or what's like the typical pushback that you get from the standard medical community?
Well, this is almost its own subject for me, and one that at some point in time, I'm going to release a book. I've actually been writing notes into it. I've written some chapters. It's not like right at the finish line. It's maybe 60% done, but I'm interested in this. There's a kind of broader story here, which is, let's just say that I'm mostly right? Let's not assume I'm totally right, but let's say that I'm mostly right in that this has been something that's been overlooked, at least this aspect. Again, and I don't want to make it sound as if I know all these other things that lipidologists don't know, but let's say I just had this one particular thing that is fairly foundational. Why was it so hard to get to a point where we could just get this in front of their eyes if this is their core interest of study, right? Particularly when I kind of grew up with a more Hollywoodized version of how I thought of scientists. I always thought scientists were endlessly curious and just can't, I feel like as an engineer, you could walk into our offices and be like, yeah, by the way, I can, make this computer run 3 times faster if I do this thing with this configuration. I'm pretty confident there wouldn't be anybody in the office that'd be like, oh, well, I've been doing this 30 years. I don't even need to look at your benchmarks. It's like, no, we would be gathering around that device and we'd be anxious to find out how that works, right? But modern medicine works very differently than that, to the extent to where I really can have particularly lipidology, I really can have all this data on hand. And that's what I brought with me to these lipidology conferences. But the moment they see like an LDL of 180 or 200, the conversation just closes. There's not like this, these folks should be treated. They shouldn't even be discussing the contribution of their data. And I get where they're coming from, because we can take this, if let's say I told you, hey, I'm now experimenting with consumption of mercury, right? It's absolutely understandable that you go like, Dave, look, I realize that you might think that this is acceptable. It's not, though. We know enough about consumption of mercury that you don't want to be doing that if you look at this study, this study, this study. So again, this is me sympathizing with where they're coming from to an extent. The catch is this is different because the whole origin of the ketogenic diet came from folks who were epileptic. This was a means of helping to resolve that. There are right now a lot of epileptics who are lean mass hyperresponders. Why wouldn't we want to study them if they're already refusing treatment long before my work or the ketogenic, or long before any cholesterol skeptics had ever gotten to them? If they were choosing to do this in the first place, we should study them. And that's the case I try to make to them, but I'm not very successful at. Because even though I take the time to emphasize to everybody, and I'll do it to your audience as well, the vast majority of lipidologists disagree with me. The guidelines are completely at odds with allowing your cholesterol to be high. And I absolutely encourage people to work with your doctors. But there are folks like epileptics, like my collaborator, Nick Norwitz, who has severe ulcerative colitis, for which keto was specifically of value. Like a number of people with type 1 diabetes. It's very different if you've got a lot of options than if you have a few options. And then it's either, hey, you go on a ketogenic diet and you take medication, or you go on a ketogenic diet and don't take medication. I think the patient's choices should be taken into account. If it seems as if they're constantly choosing against that, then study, look, get that data. It's weird to me. It's really strange to have so many folks saying we shouldn't get that data. If anything, getting the data and it possibly not showing concern levels could be dangerous in itself. It could give people false hope when in fact they're at a higher risk. That to me is, I just don't even know what to say to that. Like, that's, to me, science is about getting to the truth, period. Full stop. Even if it's the truth you don't necessarily care for, or even if it's a truth that you think can be spun in a way that you disagree with, you shouldn't be practicing precautionary principle on how somebody might spin something that's still true. As a scientist, you should still be anxious to get to what the truth is. So anyway, that's kind of my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, it's I think other than all the great work you're doing, I think that kind of high level view of it as being able to actually critique the narrative or critique conventional wisdom is always an important thing. And I think that is such a great part of the work that you're doing. So hopefully, I mean, sounds like you have a few more years of work to do on the study. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, to kind of take it even more top view than we just did, there's really just 2 questions that I'm the most interested in. One is the Lipid Energy Model, which we talked about a lot here. The other is the one of risk. And the one of risk is the bigger question. I would much rather be wrong about the energy model, but that my cautious optimism on the risk, it turns out to be well met. And again, this isn't even me saying that I needed to, confirm that there's just no risk at all, or that there's an association with longevity, anything along those lines. We just need to at least get to the big magnitude question versus small magnitude question. And that we should be able to get to quickly. In other words, if I were to tell you, hey, I think an extra, 15 minutes of sunlight a day would add another 14 days to your life span, right? That's a small magnitude effect. It's still meaningful. Like any additional days to your lifespan is a big deal. But that's not what the expectation is with, say, having an LDL of 200, 300, 400, 500. At those levels, the expectation is it's inducing an event that much sooner for like an unacceptably large portion. It kind of taking this back to the work of Brown and Goldstein, and the reason why LDL is considered to be so concerning is they were looking at children with homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. I know it's a mouthful, but basically the genetic disease that results in very high levels of LDL. And the little girl that they were looking at, that in their in their own words, said, changed their lives, set the course of their lives moving forward. She had a total LDL of, I want to say maybe, total cholesterol of, I want to say maybe 850 and an LDL of 780, something like that.
Mm.
And she was exhibiting what's known as xanthomas. They're deposits of cholesterol on the skin, which is extremely common with those who have homozygous FH. And also that she developed an angina, which is like a chronic chest pain. Both of these by age 3, which is just heartbreaking. And then she had her first heart attack, and this is hard to hear, but she had her first heart attack at age 6. And this became a very powerful narrative, because if you believe that the only reason for this was the concentration of LDL, and in particular ApoB containing lipoproteins in the bloodstream, it makes sense. You wouldn't want, you wouldn't want your own loved one to be at those levels, right? But again, and I emphasize this, there are people, even before I started this work, such as epileptics, who had gone very keto, who had seen a dramatic increase in their LDL, and who had accumulated their own data effectively at super high levels. We currently have in our groups a number of people who have an LDL above 500, which is qualified homozygous FH. I tell them on a regular basis, I say, first of all, this is uncharted territory. I'll reemphasize, this is all doctors in the world, or at least the vast majority, would say you shouldn't do this. If you are, please, report if you see the appearance of xanthomas, if you see a developing angina. Of course, we need to be honest and share this data as it appears. But so far, there's not been a lot of commonality between these two populations, between homozygous FH and lean mass hyperresponders of comparable LDL level. I say that with enormous caution, because I do not want to suggest that I know what the true outcomes are. It could be, for example, that they do develop plaque, they're just developing it at a much lower rate. So it doesn't totally get you out of the woods, but it helps. I don't know. Again, this is why we have to just get the data. We have to do things like the LMHR study to see this comparison data between a CT angiogram at the beginning and a CT angiogram at the end, just so that we have that data to look at.
And to the points that you just said, Dave, do you think it's critical for anyone that's interested in going down the high carb, low fat dietary change to get regular blood work done? Is there a particular cadence that you recommend? Like, should you get benchmark study and then track it again in a month or 2 months? How do you feel about that?
If they're doing high carb, low fat, like,
just a ketogenic diet. If someone's listening to this and thinking about making the move over, do you think that like blood work is critical for them to do? And like, how often should they be getting their blood work done just to monitor?
I am just a huge advocate of blood work, period.
Okay.
Full disclosure, we opened ownyourlabs.com because we actually wanted to match more people up with blood work. And that's not fully a plug, because part of the origin for why we did this was I wanted to fit in at the end an incentive, which is this citizen science discount, which you can opt in for. You'll get 10% off if you can submit your anonymized data for us for our archive, because not only do I want people to get individual blood work for themselves, I want us to share this data. I want it to be available for both formal and informal researchers alike, which gets back to just this whole transparency thing to me. One of the things I feel so frustrated about, and I get very vocal about this, is I'm frustrated by how few people control so much of the data related to our health, of all things. Like, I'm a technologist. We're swimming in free data all the time. Google, everything. They're constantly sharing things to us because that's our expectation level in the first place. But weirdly, and I know it's usually under the auspices that we're trying to be protective of personal health information, but weirdly, that said, there's not as much access to data as I would like. And we're trying to do our part for, making that more available. So yes, not only do I advocate for getting blood work before starting a diet, whatever diet you're going into, but I do advocate for getting frequent blood work because, again, if you look at my research, you can see how fast these things can change. If you see something in your blood work and you're like, that doesn't quite jive, that doesn't make sense with what, just get another test. They're cheap and easy to get, as a consumer these days. And forget Own Your Labs. There's plenty of services. You could go through Request a Test or Alta Labs or any of these different online reseller services. And it's easy to pull off.
Yeah, it's great to know because you were talking about Nick Norwitz. We have this weird coincidence where we both got diagnosed with ulcerative colitis in the same year. And then I leveraged a carnivore style of eating to get off all medication, the biologics that I was taking. But to your point, I have not got my blood work taken in a long time. And I'd be very interested to know, do I fall into that lean mass hyperresponder category? So just having the option to be able to go on to ownyourlabs.com is huge. So I know both of us will definitely be using that website for sure.
Yeah, we'll definitely check it out. And Dave, what's the easiest place for people to get access to your work and your information if they're interested in doing a deeper dive here?
Sure. Well, of course, cholesterolcode.com is our central site. I'll concede that we don't update it as frequently as we used to. It's mainly with major announcements now. But that's because we also are putting in more time with both Own Your Labs and Citizen Science Foundation. By the way, just one last thing with Own Your Labs, all proceeds go to Citizen Science Foundation. So actually, we only pay for fulfillment, and then all of this, the rest of this is going over to help us fund the study. But yeah, I'm also very active online. Real Dave Feldman is my username. Mm-hmm. And yes, we keep an eye on the literature. We've already published 2 papers, the lean mass hyperresponder paper, which I would recommend everybody check out because it talks about this phenomenon quite directly. And we just released a case study that actually goes into a 26-year-old who likewise saw their cholesterol levels, go up to 500 and demonstrates that it's not just saturated fat. It's closer to the energy model and that it had more to do with how lean they are. Wow. But yeah, hopefully we'll have a lot more on that. Yeah. If you guys haven't read it yet, you should. We have a video abstract actually online that's only 7 minutes long, but it's kind of through pretty easily.
I'll check that out after this for sure.
We should link to that in the show notes.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Perfect.
Well, yeah, Dave, this has been great. We really appreciate you taking the time to come on with us and chat about lean mass hyperresponders and cholesterol. This has been something different that we haven't dove into with any of our other guests. This is great.
That's great. Yeah. Thank you for having me on. This was fun.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.